The Pacific had never been so quiet. After 6 months of unstoppable victories, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the largest ocean on Earth. From the Philippines to Singapore, from the coast of Burma to the edge of New Guinea, Japan's banners fluttered above conquered skies and seas. To the men who flew the red circle of the rising sun, it felt as though the empire had become invincible. Pearl Harbor had burned. The British fleet at Singapore was gone. The Americans, they said, were finished. Their navy broken, their pilots inexperienced, their factories too far away to matter. But the ocean is a strange ally. It hides its truths until the moment of revelation. Beneath its calm blue surface, a different war was already taking shape, a war of signals, code words, and invisible hunters. In April 1942, Japan's high command set its eyes on a new objective, Port Moresby, a key harbor on the southern coast of New Guinea. Capturing it would sever Australia's supply line to America and turn the Coral Sea into a Japanese lake. It was a bold and logical move, one final strike to cut the Allies off before they could recover. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the Fourth Fleet, planned the assault with confidence. His carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, would provide air cover while invasion transports landed troops on the beaches of Moresby. Another group, under Rear Admiral Goto, would secure Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. The Americans, he believed, would be too weak and too far to interfere. But across the Pacific, in a dimly lit basement in Pearl Harbor, a handful of U.S. cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had already read his intentions. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team, still dressed in rumpled shirts from their Midway decrypts, had cracked enough of Japan's JN-25 code to know that a major operation was coming, one aimed south, not east. Their reports reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who realized at once what was at stake. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be isolated, and the Pacific War might be lost before it began. So he made a daring move. 2 American carriers, USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, were ordered into the Coral Sea. Their mission: intercept the Japanese invasion force before it reached Port Moresby. Neither side knew exactly where the other was. Neither side had radar networks or satellite eyes. What they did have were scout planes, cracked radios, and faith. On April 1, 1942, as the Japanese invasion fleet steamed south through the Bismarck Sea, the Americans moved north from the coast of Australia. Between them lay thousands of miles of open water, an empty stage for a new kind of war. The weather was cruel. Heavy clouds rolled in from the east, blotting out the sun. Visibility dropped to mere miles, sometimes less. Pilots launched on search patterns that stretched over hundreds of kilometers, trusting only their compasses and intuition. The ocean became a void, swallowing both friend and foe alike. From the bridge of Zuikaku, Captain Tatsugaku Gioma peered through binoculars at the gray horizon. The air smelled of rain and engine oil. He turned to his flight officer and said, "If the Americans are out there, we will never see them until it is too late." On the Lexington, the same tension ran through the crew. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a quiet man with a sharp mind, studied his charts. "We're sailing blind. If we find them first, we live. If they find us first, we die." No fleet had ever fought like this before. The old ways of naval war, lines of battleships exchanging shells within sight, were already relics. The new war was fought by carriers, and carriers were blind hunters. They struck not with their guns, but with their aircraft, long-range, fragile weapons launched into the void to find enemies they might never see. Inoue's plan depended on surprise. His transports would land unopposed at Moresby, while his carriers destroyed any American ships that dared to intervene. But Nimitz's codebreakers had stolen that surprise from him. For the first time, the U.S. Navy knew where Japan would strike before the battle began. The question was, could they find the enemy in time? At dawn on May 3rd, Japanese forces under Admiral Goto occupied Tulagi, a small island in the Solomons. The American reconnaissance planes spotted them within hours. Fletcher wasted no time. He launched a strike force from Yorktown, dozens of dauntless dive bombers and torpedo planes, guided only by reports from a single scout plane. When they reached Tulagi, the island below exploded in chaos. Japanese seaplanes burned where they sat, ships scattered in panic, and anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the clouds. The Americans destroyed 3 Japanese destroyers and a transport. It was a small victory, but a sign of what was coming. For the next 2 days, the Coral Sea became a theater of ghosts. Both fleets maneuvered cautiously, guided by fragments of information, an intercepted radio here, a sighting there. Search planes often passed within miles of one another, each oblivious to the other's presence in the clouds. Every hour brought new tension. Crews slept in their flight suits, engines were kept warm for immediate launch. Gunners stared at empty skies, fingers trembling on the triggers. On May 6th, the fleets drew close, so close that their scout planes crossed paths unseen in the fog. Pilots reported phantom fleets, half-truths, mirages. One American pilot swore he saw Shokaku through a break in the clouds, but by the time he circled back, the sky was empty. Another Japanese flyer returned claiming he'd sighted 2 American carriers, a report that sent shockwaves through Nagumo's staff. The admirals on both sides made their moves based on faith, not proof. That night, lightning flickered over the sea, illuminating the waves like shattered glass. Both fleets drifted within striking distance of each other, but no one knew it. Each commander was certain he would have the element of surprise come dawn. The radio rooms hummed with coded transmissions. The pilots lay in their bunks, listening to the thunder, unaware that by morning, many of them would be fighting and dying against enemies they would never actually see. A new kind of war was about to begin, one fought not by sight, but by signals, not by admirals standing on bridges, but by voices in headsets, not by the flash of guns, but by the unseen whine of engines cutting through cloud. When morning came, the Coral Sea would no longer belong to ships. It would belong to the sky. The Coral Sea lay beneath a ceiling of clouds, endless gray, drifting and heavy. The horizon was gone. Sky and water merged into one color, one texture, one silence. It was a silence that every sailor felt in his bones. Both fleets were out there somewhere, 2 vast armadas prowling through mist, searching for each other with blind hands stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. On board the Japanese carrier Shokaku, flight crews moved like ghosts. The air smelled of sweat, fuel, and nervous anticipation. The pilots sat on deck in their flight suits, smoking cigarettes in the rain. They joked in low voices, but their laughter sounded forced. Each knew that the next launch might be his last. None of them, however, realized that they were flying into history, into a battle where neither side would ever see the enemy's ships with their own eyes. To the west, aboard the USS Lexington, the situation was no different. The crew had been at battle stations for nearly 30 hours. Men dozed in gun tubs, slept on ammunition boxes, or stared at the gray sea until their eyes ached. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, pacing the bridge, studied a chart that meant almost nothing, just bearings and guesses. He turned to his chief of staff and muttered, "We're fighting in the dark. They could be 20 miles away or 200. We'll know only when it's too late." The invisible chess game had begun. Every morning, both sides launched dozens of scout planes, fragile, fuel-limited aircraft that could barely carry a radio. They fanned out in widening circles, each assigned a slice of the horizon to search. It was tedious, dangerous work. Pilots flew for hours over empty sea, scanning for the slightest hint of smoke or the glint of metal. Many never returned. Some ran out of fuel and ditched in the open ocean, their final transmissions cut off mid-sentence. One Japanese pilot later wrote in his diary, recovered after the war, "We were hunting ghosts. The ocean was too big, the sky too empty. It felt like looking for a single fish in the Pacific." On May 5th, a Japanese search plane reported sighting an American oiler and destroyer near the Louisiade archipelago. Excitement surged through the fleet. The Americans had been found, or so they thought. Strike planes launched immediately, engines screaming into the fog. But hours later, the strike leader radioed back in frustration. "Negative contact. No enemy fleet." The report had been false. The ocean swallowed the planes again, leaving only fuel fumes and silence. Aboard Shokaku, Admiral Tagaki frowned as another fruitless search ended. "The Americans hide like cowards," one officer said. Tagaki didn't answer. He knew it wasn't cowardice. It was patience. Somewhere out there, the enemy was waiting, listening, doing the same thing. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, American codebreakers aboard the Lexington's radio deck intercepted fragments of Japanese chatter, coordinates, weather reports, ship names whispered across the ether. The information was vague, but enough to convince Fletcher that the Japanese invasion convoy was approaching Port Moresby. He ordered Lexington and Yorktown to move north at full speed, threading through rain squalls and rough seas. The sailors joked that the storm was their best camouflage. It also nearly killed them. Planes slid on wet decks, ropes snapped, waves slammed into hulls. Visibility dropped to near zero, but the Americans pressed on, guided by one simple conviction: they had to stop Japan's advance, no matter what waited in the clouds ahead. At dawn on May 6th, reconnaissance planes from both sides launched once again. It was like throwing dice into the wind. Somewhere in the fog, those dice would decide the course of the war. Japanese pilot Petty Officer Kiyoshi Iwachi took off from Zuikaku, climbing into a sky so overcast that his instruments iced over. He strained to see the sea below through breaks in the cloud deck. "It was like flying through smoke," he recalled later. "I kept expecting to see their masts, their wakes, but there was nothing, just the gray." After 3 hours, low on fuel, he turned back and unknowingly passed within 30 miles of Yorktown's position. At nearly the same moment, an American scout plane from Lexington, piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph G. Smith, was flying his own lonely patrol. He too saw nothing, until, through a gap in the clouds, he glimpsed what looked like wakes slicing the surface of the sea. He dove lower and saw hulls, destroyers, transports, and a light carrier. His voice cracked through the radio. "Enemy sighted! Large formation, bearing 120, distance 180. The message electrified Fletcher's bridge. Finally, the enemy was real. "Launch everything we have," Fletcher ordered. At 900, the flight decks of Yorktown and Lexington erupted in motion. Plane after plane roared down the deck and into the storm. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, escort fighters. The decks trembled with power. Below, mechanics wiped sweat and oil from their faces, praying the next hours wouldn't be their last. Through the clouds they flew, navigating by dead reckoning, guided only by the coordinates from Smith's sighting. The Americans had no radar, no homing beacons, only compasses, maps, and courage. For 2 hours, they searched the endless gray,
until suddenly the mist parted. Below them lay Tulagi, the small island base the Japanese had seized 2 days earlier, and around it, ships. The U.S. strike group descended from the clouds in formation, like hawks on prey. Bombs fell, explosions ripped across the lagoon. Japanese ships scattered, anti-aircraft fire peppered the sky, and smoke bloomed in black columns that pierced the overcast. The light carrier Shoho, caught off guard while refueling her aircraft, took 2 bomb hits and several torpedo strikes. Flames erupted across her deck. Pilots on both sides watched in shock. The first Japanese carrier to be sunk in the Pacific War was going down before their eyes. From the smoke, a desperate radio signal crackled across Japanese frequencies. "Shoho is sinking! Help! Shoho is—" Then silence. The ocean swallowed her whole. But the Americans had paid for their success in uncertainty. Fletcher's pilots returned to their carriers believing they had struck Japan's main force. In reality, the Shoho was merely a small escort. The real Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, still lurked to the north, untouched and ready. Inoue and Tagaki, furious and astonished, now knew the Americans were in the Coral Sea, but not where. They ordered massive search efforts, dozens of planes sweeping the sky. For hours they found nothing. The fog thickened again. Each admiral now knew the other was near. Each fleet now prepared for the inevitable. The next day, May 7th, would decide who would live and who would vanish into the fog. No one could see the enemy, but everyone could feel him.
At 4:30 a.m., the Coral Sea was still a void. Gray sky, gray water, gray uncertainty. Both fleets knew the other was close, but the ocean refused to give up its secrets. The silence before dawn was not peace. It was tension drawn to the breaking point. On every bridge, from Shokaku to Lexington, from Zuikaku to Yorktown, officers stared into the mist and wondered if death was already inbound through the clouds. At 500 hours, Admiral Takagi aboard Shokaku broke the silence. Launch search planes, begin attack preparation. Engines thundered to life. On deck, Japanese flight crews worked in silence, pushing torpedo bombers and dive bombers into position, strapping down fuel lines, arming bombs. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the humid air. The ocean rolled gently beneath them, the calm before a storm that none of them could see. Thousands of miles away, in Washington, intelligence officers were already reading faint radio traffic, American decrypts of Japanese fleet positions. But in the Coral Sea, those signals were only static, ghosts in the ether. The battle that morning would be fought not by admirals in command rooms, but by pilots guided by half-heard orders and instinct. At 6 a.m., an American scout plane from Yorktown, flown by Lieutenant Joseph G. Smith, broke through the clouds and saw something that made his blood run cold. Dark specks on the ocean, Japanese ships. He leaned into his radio, shouting over the engine roar, "Enemy sighted! 2 carriers, multiple escorts, bearing 110 degrees." Then the transmission crackled out. The coordinates were wrong, but to Admiral Fletcher on Yorktown's bridge, it didn't matter. They had a heading. Launch the strike, all available aircraft. Within minutes, the flight decks of Lexington and Yorktown were alive with motion. Bombers and torpedo planes thundered into the air, their propellers slicing the mist. The decks vibrated with the force of engines straining for lift. Men cheered each departing aircraft, like a prayer leaving their lips. Fletcher watched them vanish into the clouds, their silhouettes swallowed by the fog, and whispered, "God help them find the right ships." Meanwhile, the Japanese had made the same mistake. At nearly the same hour, a reconnaissance plane from Shokaku reported sighting 2 American carriers. The coordinates were wrong. It had found an American oiler, the Neosho, and her escort destroyer Sims.
But Takagi, eager to strike first, did not hesitate. He launched 78 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes toward the false target. Both sides had sent death in opposite directions, guided by confusion and courage. As the Japanese planes raced south toward their phantom prey, the American strike group closed in from the east. The clouds broke open suddenly, revealing the sea below and a small Japanese force. It wasn't the main fleet, but it was enough. Below them lay the light carrier Shoho, flanked by cruisers and destroyers maneuvering at high speed. Commander William B. Alt, leading the U.S. dive bombers, saw the sight first. "That's our target," he shouted. "All planes attack." The sky filled with descending aircraft. Bombs fell like rain. From Shoho's deck, gunners opened fire, their tracers vanishing into the clouds. Then the first bombs hit. 2, then 4, then 6. The carrier staggered under the impacts, explosions ripping open her hangars. Torpedo wakes streaked toward her sides. Within minutes, she was on fire from bow to stern. "Shoho is sinking," one Japanese pilot screamed over the radio. His voice was frantic, disbelieving. "Send help! The carrier is—" His transmission dissolved into static. From above, American pilots circled once, stunned by the ferocity of the destruction. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, watching the burning ship below, transmitted the words that would echo through naval history. "Scratch one flat top." It was 11 a.m., the first Japanese carrier ever sunk by American aircraft. But victory came with ignorance. Fletcher believed he had destroyed one of Japan's main carriers, Shokaku or Zuikaku, and pulled his strike groups back, preparing for counterattack. In reality, he had hit the wrong target entirely. The real carriers were still untouched, and now they knew exactly where the Americans were. To the north, Shokaku's flight deck became a storm of preparation. "Launch the second wave," Takagi ordered. Pilots scrambled into their cockpits, engines roaring. They took off into thick cloud banks, their instruments glowing dimly in the gloom. Below, sailors watched until the planes vanished, swallowed by fog. The Japanese air groups flew for 2 hours, searching for the American fleet. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Then, far to the south, they spotted dark shapes through a break in the overcast. Ships. Carriers, they thought. They dove. But the targets weren't Lexington or Yorktown. It was the American oiler Neosho and the destroyer USS Sims, sailing alone and unprotected. The Japanese pilots, realizing the error only seconds too late, attacked anyway. Bombs tore into Sims, breaking her in half. The Neosho was left a burning hulk, her crew leaping into the sea. The Japanese commander radioed back, 2 enemy carriers destroyed. The mistake would change everything. By nightfall, both fleets believed they had crippled the other. In reality, the main carrier forces were still intact and within striking distance. The stage was set for the most surreal battle the world had ever seen. That evening, the Coral Sea glowed with lightning. Rain lashed the decks. Crews huddled below, exhausted, their nerves frayed by tension and false reports. In the dark, each fleet plotted the next day's strike, each admiral certain that he held the advantage. Neither had seen the other ships. Neither had fired a single gun in direct sight. And yet, hundreds of men were already dead. In the coming dawn, they would finally strike at the true enemy. But even then, they would never see him with their eyes. The age of visible war was over. The next day, May 8th, 1942, would prove it beyond doubt.
Dawn came as a dim gray glow over the Coral Sea, filtered through heavy clouds and rain. The ocean below was calm, deceptively so, a mirror hiding fleets that could not see one another yet knew they were near, too near. It was the morning of May 8th, 1942, and for the first time in human history, 2 carrier forces were poised to destroy each other without ever coming within sight. On the USS Lexington, sailors worked in silence, their boots splashing through shallow puddles in the deck. The air smelled of oil and ozone, the scent of tension before a storm. "Enemy planes are out there somewhere," one gunner muttered. "But how do you shoot what you can't see?" In the ready room, pilots sat strapped in their cockpits, engines idling, their eyes fixed on the flight deck crewmen waving signal flags. To the north, aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku, it was the same scene, a mirror of preparation, nerves, and ritual. Admiral Tagagi stood on the bridge, binoculars raised to the horizon. The storm clouds stretched in all directions, blending sea and sky into one shifting blur. His chief of staff spoke quietly. "The enemy is close. They must be." Tagagi nodded. "Then we strike first." At 6 a.m., both sides launched their search planes. By sheer chance, they found each other almost simultaneously. At 8:15 a.m., an American scout plane from Yorktown broke through a hole in the clouds and saw it. 4 carriers below, their decks dotted with aircraft. "Enemy sighted," he radioed. 2 carriers, heading south." Moments later, far to the north, a Japanese search pilot spotted 2 American carriers steaming east. His voice came through the static to Shokaku. "Enemy carriers located. Request permission to engage." On both bridges, the same order echoed. "Launch all attack planes." Engines roared, propellers blurred, flight decks vanished and fire in motion as dozens of bombers and torpedo planes clawed their way into the sky. Within minutes, both fleets had unleashed their full air power, their squadrons flying toward one another through miles of storm and cloud. It was as if 2 armies had drawn their swords and swung, blindfolded. At 9 a.m., the American strike force sighted the Japanese first. The clouds opened, revealing the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku below, white wakes streaking the sea. "We've got 'em!" shouted Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading the Yorktown dive bombers. "All hands attack!" The sky came alive with chaos. Dive bombers dropped through the clouds like stones, sirens howling, engines screaming. Japanese Zeros scrambled to intercept, twisting upward through the gray, their guns flashing. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the decks below, filling the air with black bursts. The Americans dove straight through it. Bombs fell. At 11 a.m., Shokaku shuddered under the impact of 3 direct hits. Explosions tore through her flight deck, sending smoke and flame into the air. Her elevators jammed, hangars ignited, and aircraft fuel flooded the lower decks. Sailors ran for cover as ammunition stores detonated, the blasts echoing across the sea. The carrier's flight deck buckled, blackened, and then lay still, a ruined hulk, rolling helplessly in the waves. Above, the American pilots pulled up through smoke and cloud, their formation ragged, their voices shaky over the radio. Target hit, she's burning bad," one reported. Another whispered, "God, look at her." But even as the Americans struck home, the Japanese counterattack was already underway. Their own strike group had found the U.S. carriers almost at the same moment. The American radar operators on Lexington picked up the blips first. Inbound aircraft, bearing 020 distance 60 miles. The klaxon sounded instantly. "Air raid warning, man your battle stations." The sky that had moments ago been empty now filled with distant specks, dozens of them approaching fast. Gunners swung their weapons skyward. Pilots raced to launch the combat air patrol. The roar of engines, the clatter of ammunition belts, the shouted orders, it all blurred into one rising crescendo of noise and fear. "Here they come!" someone shouted. The Japanese torpedo bombers attacked first, skimming low across the water, their silhouettes flashing through the haze. The Lexington and Yorktown turned hard to avoid them, their hulls heeling under the strain. Torpedoes streaked through the water, white trails, cutting across the waves. Then the dive bombers came, Vals, their sirens screaming as they plunged from the clouds. Bombs exploded around the ships, geysers of water rising like pillars. The Yorktown took a glancing hit. Flames burst briefly from her deck before damage control contained it. The Lexington was not so lucky. At 12:30 p.m., Lexington was struck by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs in quick succession. The hits tore open her port side and shattered her fuel lines. Within minutes, aviation gasoline began leaking through her ship, fumes filling her passageways. Fire spread invisibly, carried by vapor. On the bridge, Captain Frederick Sherman remained calm. "Damage control, report." The reply came through static. Multiple fires, port hangar deck. "We're fighting them." But he could hear the panic in the background. Below decks, sailors battled the flames in near darkness. The heat was suffocating. One man later wrote, "The air burned before the fire ever reached us. It felt like breathing through sandpaper." At 12:47 p.m., a spark, no one knew from where, ignited the gasoline vapors. The explosion ripped through the Lexington from bow to stern. The flight deck lifted, smoke gushed from her elevators, and fire poured from her sides. "The Lady Lex is done for," an officer whispered. Sherman gave the order no captain ever wanted to speak. Abandon ship. As lifeboats were lowered and destroyers came alongside to rescue survivors, the Lexington burned with a terrible beauty. Her flames reached hundreds of feet into the air, reflected on the oily surface of the sea. The Japanese pilots, now circling for home, saw the plume and believed they had sunk both carriers. But they hadn't. The Yorktown still lived, her deck patched, her engines intact. The Shokaku, too, though crippled, had not gone down. Zoikaku remained untouched. Both sides had dealt terrible blows, and both had failed to destroy the other completely. The battle had lasted less than half a day. When it ended, the sea fell silent again, littered with smoke, wreckage, and oil. That night, Admiral Fletcher watched from the deck of Yorktown as the Lexington's fires still flickered in the distance. At 7:15 p.m., her remaining crew scuttled her with torpedoes. The great carrier rolled slowly, her burning hulk sinking beneath the waves. A deep, muffled roar marked her passing. The men who watched said nothing. Some saluted, some turned away. On the Shokaku, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Tagagi received his own reports. Damage severe, losses catastrophic. He too knew what had been lost, even if he would not yet say it aloud. The Empire had not been defeated, but its aura of invincibility had been pierced. Neither fleet had ever seen the other. Not one gun had been fired ship to ship, yet hundreds were dead, and two great carriers were gone. For the first time in history, a battle had been fought, and won, and lost, by enemies who never laid eyes on one another.
When the sun rose over the Coral Sea on May 9, 1942, the ocean was quiet again. The great fleets had turned away from each other during the night, retreating in opposite directions like exhausted prize fighters. Smoke still drifted on the horizon where Lexington had burned and sunk. Oil slicks glimmered in the early light, dotted with the debris of a battle that had rewritten the laws of war. For the men who had fought there, it was difficult to understand what they had just experienced. They had not seen their enemy, yet they had destroyed and been destroyed by him. The sailors, the pilots, and the admirals would later realize they had been witnesses to the birth of modern warfare. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, now aboard the battered Yorktown, reviewed the damage reports with red-rimmed eyes. His flagship was leaking fuel, her decks scarred, her crews exhausted, but she could still sail, and that was enough. They had held the line. Japan's invasion fleet, battered and leaderless, was turning back. Port Moresby was safe. It was a strange sort of victory, one measured not in territory gained, but in survival itself. Far to the north, Admiral Takeo Takagi gathered his staff in Shokaku's wardroom. The carrier listed slightly, her flight deck shattered by bombs, her elevators twisted like broken ribs. Reports from Zuikaku were little better, half her air group gone, the rest scattered or out of fuel. Takagi listened in silence as his officers listed the losses: 90 aircraft, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, and worst of all, the momentum of Japan's advance. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had failed to win a decisive victory. When the meeting ended, Takagi walked out to the shattered deck. The wind howled through the wreckage. Below him, the sea stretched out in all directions, limitless, indifferent. "So this," he murmured, "is what it means to fight without seeing." In Tokyo, the official reports were carefully worded. The Ministry of the Navy announced a brilliant tactical success, the sinking of 2 enemy carriers, and the loss of 1 small Japanese vessel. The reality was far different, but propaganda demanded triumph. Yet even in the halls of the Naval General Staff, a quiet unease took hold. The reports from Shokaku's surviving officers were unlike anything the old admirals had ever read. The enemy had struck from beyond the horizon, guided by aircraft and radio, not guns and optics. The battleship, the traditional symbol of naval power, had been useless. None of the great guns of the Yamato, Mutsu, or Nagato had fired a shot. They had been too far away, too blind. For the first time, the fate of fleets had been decided entirely in the sky. The world had changed, and few realized it yet. In Washington, Admiral Chester William Nimitz studied the after-action reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters. His staff expected anger over the loss of Lexington. Instead, Nimitz smiled grimly. "It's the first time we've stopped them. That's enough." For months, Japan had swept across the Pacific unchecked, but the Coral Sea had drawn a line, an invisible one, carved not by guns or walls, but by courage, intelligence, and the newfound reach of aircraft carriers. For the first time, the Imperial Navy's advance had been halted. The victory was not decisive, but it was symbolic. It proved that Japan could be stopped, that American resolve could meet Japanese precision and not break. More importantly, Nimitz understood what few yet grasped. The Coral Sea was not just a battle, it was a blueprint. The age of the carrier had truly arrived. For the pilots, the memory of those days never faded. Lieutenant John Jojo Powers, who had led one of the final dive-bombing runs against Shokaku, was killed later that same month at Midway. Before he died, he told a fellow pilot, "They'll never fight the same way again. The ocean's too big. The ships are too small. The sky, that's where wars are won now." He was right. A month later, at Midway, the lessons of Coral Sea would decide the war. The American carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, would strike Japan's fleet the same way they had fought here, unseen, coordinated by radio and intelligence, attacking from beyond visual range. In that battle, 4 of Japan's carriers, including Akagi and Kaga, would burn and sink, the price of an empire built on an old way of war. But the Coral Sea was more than a prelude. It was the threshold between eras. For centuries, naval warfare had meant line-of-sight engagements, ships firing guns at ships. At the Coral Sea, those rules vanished. Technology replaced eyesight. Strategy became mathematics, fuel ranges, radio frequencies, radar echoes. The admirals who once commanded from open bridges now fought their wars through headphones and signal boards, guided by voices from the clouds. Japanese pilots who survived the battle later admitted their confusion and fear. One wrote in his diary, "We never saw them. Our guns fired into empty sky. The enemy was invisible, yet everywhere. It was like fighting ghosts." American pilots said much the same. They remembered not faces, not ships, but the sound, the steady hum of engines in clouds, the bursts of anti-aircraft fire from nowhere, the sight of explosions on the ocean's surface with no enemy in view. It was a war stripped of human proximity, replaced by technology and faith. When the fleets finally returned home, they left behind an ocean forever changed. The Coral Sea, once a tranquil stretch of blue between Australia and New Guinea, had become a graveyard of beginnings, the birthplace of modern naval combat. The men who fought there had seen the future without realizing it. They had fought blind, guided only by sound, instinct, and radio static, and in doing so they had discovered the new shape of war. No longer would admirals command by sight. No longer would gunners look their enemies in the eye. From now on, wars at sea would be decided by those who could see without seeing. Radar, radio, reconnaissance, the unseen weapons of the future. In Tokyo, Admiral Takagi's final report ended with a single haunting line. The enemy's location was unknown, yet his power was everywhere. And in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz wrote his own note to Washington. This was not a defeat. It was an awakening. The Coral Sea was the first test, and it will not be the last. A month later, that prophecy came true. Midway turned the tide. The carriers that had fought in fog and silence met again, but this time the Americans struck first, guided by lessons learned in the Coral Sea. The world never went back. The sea had birthed a new kind of war, one fought in the air, led by machines, decided by intelligence, and haunted by men who never saw their enemies' faces. And for those who survived, one truth lingered long after the last wave had fallen still. They had lived through the day the old world died, and the modern one was born.